coupled with the distinguished lecture of the Public Diplomacy Division of the Ministry of External Affairs, Government of India. We are privileged to have amongst us Ambassador Rajiv Kumar Bhatia, who is currently the Director General of Indian Council of World Affairs, as our speaker. Detailed introduction of him will be given by Professor Agrawal in due course of time. Sir, I request Professor Rajiv Sangal, our Director, and Mr. Rajiv K. Bhatia to please come to dais. And I further request you that please pay full tribute to Mahamana on duty. I now invite Professor Rajiv Kumar Agrawal, member Institute Lecture Series, to introduce the speaker of the day. Agrawal.
Very good morning to all of you. I feel privileged to introduce the great person, great personality sitting on the dais, Ambassador Rajiv Kumar Bhatia ji. He is an IFS. Naturally, he is in this position because of his hard labor, focus, approach, everything. And when you come this personality, my dear listeners, you have a lot to learn. So, Rajiv Kumar Bhatia ji is the Director General of Indian Council of World Affairs, and he has enjoyed this position since 2012. As a career diplomat, he has served India with distinction for over 37 years. It's a long period. And he was India's ambassador and high commissioner in Kenya, Myanmar, Mexico, and South Africa. Presently, he is also the member of Academic Council of Jawaharlal Nehru University. He is the member of Governing Council of National Institute of Design, and also he is the member secretary of Governing Council of ICWA. Bhatia ji is known for his intellectual inclination. Ambassador Bhatia, he enjoys writing, speaking on a wide range of foreign policy related issues. Of course, he has retired, but he is still very, very active. After his retirement from our Indian Foreign Service in 2009, he has published over a very, very short duration 125 articles on international affairs in India's national dailies, journals, and periodicals. He has delivered lectures at the National Defence College, Foreign Service Institute, universities, and other institutions in India. He has been interviewed by BBC, Bloomberg News, AP, NDTV, Doordarshan, and Lok Sabha TV. Since mid-2012, Ambassador Bhatia has led ICWA delegation to Russia, China, Belgium, particularly for interaction with EU countries, Australia, Indonesia, Vietnam, and also Myanmar. He has also addressed TACFU conference in Beijing, Shanghai, Port Louis, and Paris, and has interacted with leading candidates in London, Kuala Lumpur, and Jakarta. Of course, maybe I have a lot to say about him, but because it will take a lot of time and we have maybe very short time for the lecture, so without wasting time on such petty issues, I have tried to keep the time reserved for listening to Bhatia ji. So I now invite Bhatia ji to deliver his talk on the subject challenges for India's foreign policy in the next decade. Bhatia ji.
Thank you very much, Professor Sangal, Director of Indian Institute of Technology, BHU. Thank you also very much, Dr. Jha, Dean Social Sciences, Dr. Sharma, Dr. Agrawal. Thank you very much for your kind introduction. Thank you also Professor Sanjay Srivastava, who's here as a link with Delhi, and of course a very warm welcome to Dr. Mahendra, who is here, other esteemed members of the faculty, and my young friends. I'm really impressed by your devotion to be here for this event on Saturday morning, just a day before the holy festival of Raksha Bandhan. But I feel that this would be a very good occasion not to have a lecture but a dialogue, and I'll come to that in a minute. Let me first of all say how delighted I feel to be at this historic and hallowed institution of national importance, Banaras Hindu University and the Indian Institute of Technology here in Varanasi. When I was studying at Allahabad several decades back, and even before that, as I grew up in the school and college, I had read about the sterling contribution made to the country's history, to freedom struggle, to the spread of higher education by Malviya. Mahamana Madan Mohan Malviya is an icon of Indian modern history, and so it is only appropriate that we pay our heartfelt tribute to him and we recognize a basic fact how one man can make a difference, how one human being can create an institution which continues to benefit generations after generations. When this morning I was having my breakfast in the dining hall at the Gandhi Technology Alumni Center, I saw on the wall two photographs, one of Malviya and the other of Goddess Saraswati. So it was very appropriate because all of us, you and us, who recognize the importance of higher education, would agree that here, this years that we spent in this institution is really in the Saraswati Sadhana, and that Saraswati Sadhana has been made possible by Malviya. So we remain very, very deeply grateful to him. May I also express my deep appreciation to your institution and also to the Ministry of External Affairs, because these two, IIT, BHU and MEA, they collaborated to ensure that this event happens today. This is under the MEA's Distinguished Lecture Series and also this institution's Institute Lecture Series. And I very much hope that this will create the kind of interest that we want our young Indians to show in subjects and issues other than what they study in their own classrooms. For me, believe me, this is a very special, invaluable opportunity to connect with young India, the leaders of tomorrow. And not just India, I know that there are scholars also from foreign countries. So young human beings from India and other countries who will contribute to a strong and developed and vibrant India, and who would also build their own countries when they return to their homelands. I also want to say a word about Varanasi, the historic city that it is. It played a very critical role in the recent general elections. And this was so because Shri Narendra Modi, Prime Minister, was a candidate from this city, and therefore the city received global attention. And we also know that he has given solemn assurances for the progress and transformation of Varanasi and the surrounding region. And I can only say that as these assurances get implemented and fulfilled, it's a subject which will be watched closely, not merely in India, but also internationally, because the transformation of Varanasi will mirror the transformation of India. So I said right in the beginning, not a lecture, but a conversation. The conversation is more interesting, but before a conversation can take place, I have to have my say to you so that the conversation becomes more focused and it becomes more meaningful and useful. So essentially, in what capacity am I speaking to you? I think speak on the basis of my years of experience as a university lecturer, as a diplomat, and as a member of the strategic community of India. As was mentioned earlier, I am managing India's oldest foreign policy think tank, the Indian Council of World Affairs. We have a compact research faculty of about 20 PhD scholars who are area specialists of various parts of the world. And with their help, we do study, we do research, we do external dialogue, we do outreach activities, we connect with the universities in India. And the essential idea is that the knowledge about India's foreign policy is disseminated both within India and also within the world. And so from that point of view, what I'm doing now in my post-retirement life, which gives me immense pleasure and satisfaction, is also a kind of a public service so that we get a chance to connect with people such as you. Now, in terms of the PowerPoint presentation, which has been specially prepared for you, the agenda is mentioned here, and now we probably can start so that we can straight away begin with this. So I talked about your university, and I said that really I want a conversation, so the idea is not to represent the viewpoint of a government or even strictly speaking my own institution, but give you a sense of one's wide-ranging view of foreign policy states. So, three pictures I don't have to explain perhaps. Your own university, ICWA Delhi, and I'm sure most of you would recognize Nobel laureate Aung San Suu Kyi, one of the most outstanding persons living in the world today, the leader of democracy. I think between her and Nelson Mandela, we can say that in our generation, these have been among the two people who have impacted on the world. So now, we need to explain a little bit the title, Challenges for the Indian Foreign Policy. And essentially what I can say is that challenges for Indian foreign policy are really the challenges, both internal and external, that India faces today. So when we talk about foreign policy, we are talking about this great country, and we are trying to understand what exactly are the challenges that we are going to analyze and examine here today. But what one can say is a bit about foreign policy. Foreign policy is nothing but pursuit of national interests of a country, and this is obviously done through various instruments that are available to us. These are the instruments of diplomacy, which is the way we execute or implement our foreign policy. But there are other instruments also, and these instruments also include naturally military power, economic strength, covert action, and what is known as soft power. Soft power being our culture, arts, education, and our general ability to influence other civilizations, other societies. So essentially, when the strategic experts talk about foreign policy and national interest, they always make a reference to three kinds of power: hard power, which is essentially military power; soft power, which is culture and civilizational impact; and when we do a combination of these two, that becomes smart power. So fundamentally, the challenges that we face, our country faces, they need to be addressed through a judicious use or deployment of soft power, and that is essentially what every government tries to do. But let us come back again to the question of challenges. Now I know each of you, the key students of engineering, technology, social sciences, and if each of you is given an opportunity to make a list of the challenges facing India or challenges facing your own country if you are from Africa or Southeast Asia or wherever it may be your country, it should be very easy and possible for you to prepare a list of your own. What I have done is to prepare a list of my own and have tried to make it as extensive as possible, although it cannot be a complete list. And I would like to read this to you so that we begin to first take a grip on what the challenges are. I think that my list will include faster, broader, and more equitable economic development that creates jobs, expands the triple segments of agriculture, industry, and services, improves infrastructure, including supply of clean air, water, and power, then better governance through more efficient delivery of services by central, state, and local governments, then reduction in corruption, then effective countering of terrorism and other threats to internal security, then marked improvement in other sectors, healthcare, education, environment, women's safety and empowerment, and above all, perceptible enhancement of economic, military, and diplomatic strength so that India emerges truly as a great power. So this is the list of challenges. Some may say this is the list, the wish list, but I think those of us who have experienced and who have a positive bent of mind would say that yes, these are the challenges, and India's leaders as well as India's people would have to find a way to grapple with them and to address them. And my central point here on the slide is, and I say this by pointing out that I don't belong to any political party. I don't belong to the Congress party or the BJP or any other party. I've been a civil servant, a professional civil servant throughout my life, and now as a scholar diplomat, objectivity remains my guiding mantra. But I think one has to accept that all these challenges on the wish list that I talked about, this got embodied in this mantra, Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas. And you don't have to take my word for it. The incontrovertible evidence is that this mantra and this party and this leader was successful in persuading the people of India, the electorate of India, to give a clear majority to a single party in the last elections, and that this was a development that happened in the country for the first time since 1985. So it's a development of great importance, and that is the reason that this is a very, very good time to study India, and by studying India internally, we then would be able to understand India's foreign policy. A former foreign minister said some time back, an Indian foreign minister, that India is experiencing simultaneously an urban revolution, industrial revolution, social revolution, and democratic revolution. And in a way, I can say, my young friends, you are at the cutting edge of that revolution, because you have now moved beyond the comfort and security zone of your homes. You are preparing for a future, you are working hard for a degree, and you already are concerned, you are planning, you are dreaming about one thing that is common to all of you: how to get a good job or how to get a good break in life, so that as a full-fledged member of society, you could begin to contribute to this country and the resolution of its problems. So essentially, you are what is known as the aspirational generation. You are part of the revolution of explosion of expectations, about which social scientists wrote extensively in the past, and that revolution of explosion of expectations is now upon us. And as I said there, the revolution is that everyone wants its basic needs fulfilled in the shortest possible time. Indians are impatient, and India demands. And you are part of that India which wants to take this country forward in the direction of progress. So in that larger backdrop, I think let us focus a little bit more closely on foreign policy. And this subheading that I gave to this part is evolution and philosophy of the foreign policy. You will appreciate that without getting a grip on the philosophy, it's difficult to understand how foreign policy is made or executed. And I think I would make the essential point here that regardless of whatever may be your political ideology, an objective fact is that Jawaharlal Nehru left an indelible imprint on the way India saw, interpreted, and chose to connect with the colonial and the post-colonial world. Those of us who are the specialists of the subject know his immense impact. It did not begin in 1947 when he became the Prime Minister. It began probably in the 20s, when after his return to India, he found that he was probably the best studied man, or the best informed man about world affairs, and how he worked through the 20s, 30s and 40s to cultivate friendships in various parts of the world, and how he began to strongly feel that the independence of India would not be complete until the last colonized country was liberated and made independent, and that after independence, the free India worked for that goal. It's very difficult to summarize Nehruvian philosophy or foreign policy, but I'm trying to say that three responsibility for Asian unity, principles, the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, and non-alignment, that is to stay away from the military blocs, and also create Afro-Asian solidarity. Now here we really need to also mention that my institution, the Indian Council of World Affairs, was actually established even before the independence of India by people who were inspired by Jawaharlal Nehru. And so, even before the independence came, under inspiration of Jawaharlal Nehru, the first Asian Relations Conference was organized in Delhi, and that was done with the full involvement and assistance of the ICWA. So we feel very connected with the way the foreign policy thinking of Free India developed right on our premises, and it is that philosophy which has continued to evolve, which has been adapted, and I would show briefly as to where it has reached now. After Nehru, the successors, particularly Indira Gandhi, she did what can be called in modern world rebalancing. She introduced a very strong dose of pragmatism, because as you know, the critics say that Nehru could often be very idealistic, but Indira Gandhi was a practical and pragmatic person, and that is why you know, if Nehru era is remembered for India losing the conflict with China in 1962, Indira era is remembered for the victory that India attained over Pakistan and the creation resultantly of Bangladesh in 1971. Moving from Indira to the subsequent period, we have to remember two exceptionally creative prime ministers. One was P.V. Narasimha Rao, who belonged and led the Congress-centered coalition government, and later Atal Bihari Vajpayee, who was the prime minister of the first NDA government. These two brought significant changes to the foreign policy without changing its overall framework, and they, in particular terms, tried to strengthen and improve India's relations with the West. They tried to rebalance India's West Asia policy by bringing India's cooperation to the right, and particularly Narasimha Rao, obviously, was the person who started off the Look East policy of India, and this also was very much carried forward by Mr. Vajpayee. On top of that, what Mr. Narasimha Rao did not do, but what Mr. Vajpayee did, was to order the nuclear tests in 1998, and thereby announcing to the world the arrival of India as a nuclear weapon power, as a strong role player and actor in the world community. So in this light, we can come very quickly to Dr. Manmohan Singh, the last Prime Minister, and we are talking now about 10 years, 2004 to 2014, and mention the 5 central elements of Dr. Manmohan Singh's foreign policy here, which is also important to remember. The first 2 points essentially relate to the economic dimension of foreign policy. The third one relates to close relations with major powers. The fourth with the primacy to South Asia that our foreign policy enjoys. And the last one is about balancing between principles and values. So you would see, if you take a grip of these 5 elements, they plus what I've said about the earlier period, this would constitute an extremely good way to study the foreign policy of the contemporary, of the present era. I think it's important to bring it right up to date to say, and this is something that I'm going to very quickly read from my paper, because last year in Chennai, when Shri Narendra Modi was the Chief Minister of Gujarat and was clearly emerging as the leading candidate for the Prime Minister, he had stressed that the pillars of foreign policy should be strategy and security. He had portrayed Shri Vajpayee as the devotee of Shakti and Shanti, power and peace, and he had called for working together for a bold India and a better world. And this idea that was fully reflected when President Pranab Mukherjee gave the first speech to the Parliament on behalf of the new government. As you know, the President reads the speech drafted by the Cabinet, by the government, and in that speech, President Mukherjee said words which reflected, the thoughts of the new government very accurately. He talked about India's commitment to the vision of a strong India, self-reliant and self-confident India, regaining a rightful place in the Committee of Nations. So you could see the vision that is now imbuing the foreign policy. And I think one can also make a brief reference just to make the whole thing up to date is what External Affairs Minister Sushma Swaraj ji said on 23rd July when she spoke in the Parliament, and she briefed the Parliament about Prime Minister Narendra Modi's visit to Brazil to participate in the BRICS summit, and she said that it was essential for the government to pursue proactive and broad-based international engagement to advance our national development and security. And this is very important, and to fulfill our international responsibilities to build a peaceful and prosperous world. So in effect, this is truly the embodiment of what is called enlightened national interest. We want to certainly look after the interests of India, but we shall not forget the responsibilities that India has as a major international role player. So, from here now, my next theme is neighborhood. I think even if you are keen students of engineering technology, you certainly watch television, and you would know how in the past 2 months there has been a tremendous focus on India's relations with our neighboring countries, South Asia. And this is best reflected by the fact that on the very first day of the government, the swearing-in ceremony, something was done by the present government which nobody had done before. And this was to invite all the SAARC leaders and Prime Minister of Mauritius to attend the swearing-in ceremony, not just of the Prime Minister, it was of the government. And they were all there. This had not happened in our area ever before. This was one single decision implemented flawlessly, which brought kudos for India from around the world. And people still are feathering and dissecting as to whose idea it was and how quickly it could be executed. But it was taken up very well, it was received very well in the neighboring countries and indeed around the world. And this constructive approach is continuing, as we have seen from the subsequent visits of the External Affairs Minister to the neighboring countries, and also visits by the Prime Minister both to Bhutan and to Nepal. There has been such heavy-duty, extensive coverage of the positive reactions generated in those two countries towards India that even the hard, skeptical, veteran type of experts of foreign policy, they have no choice but to concede that India policymakers are on the right track, and India's new leaders seem to be fully determined, first of all, to ensure that in this neighborhood of ours, there is policy of friendship and cooperation and harmony. Now, what I would like to say is that after all the media grabbing developments are over, begins the hard one. And you would be perfectly entitled to ask as to what really happens in terms of actual change, actual transformation. And here I have prepared a list of what we call plucking low-hanging fruits. These are some of the main things that, in my personal view, the government should focus on, and probably it will focus on. One or two relatively easier issues to resolve with each of the neighbors, so that our commitments begin to get fulfilled. I won't be able to go into detail, but I can say that with Bangladesh we have the non-land boundary agreement that needs to be cleared by the parliament and then implemented. With Sri Lanka we have a very complex fishermen's problems that can be and should be resolved sooner rather than later. With Myanmar we have done tremendous amount of work in the past 3 or 4 years to improve relations. But now in that country, once again, political situation is gradually getting complicated. They still are on the reform path, and therefore India should keep them under a close, friendly watch and make sure that we work with everybody so that we are regarded as everybody's friend there. Nepal, I'm sure you've heard and read a lot about. I think the central point is that we have to encourage Nepal to complete its constitution making as soon as possible, and then start focusing along with it, not then, but along with it, start focusing on some of the cooperation initiatives with India that Mr. Modi and the Prime Minister Devan discussed just recently. And then there is the question of Afghanistan, which is passing through a major transition and has come to continue nurturing our ties with this very critical and strategic neighbor. And finally, about Pakistan. What should we do in our relations with Pakistan? This is one of the biggest challenges. But I think, having heard both sides, those who say, don't talk to them, and those who say, no, you have to talk to them, my sober view would be that a dialogue would have to be begun very soon. And I think there should be an attempt to try to resolve some of the simpler problems in terms of building up trade cooperation and facilitating, travel and people-to-people ties. But at the same time, we would have to continue to insist that Pakistan must give us satisfaction on the issue of terrorism. I think they have to be, very clearly made to understand or persuaded to understand that if there is terrorism from Pakistani soil that targets India, then relationship cannot be made normal and cooperative and friendly. Pakistan is a country which is passing through its own complex crisis. They have to resolve it themselves. Maybe they themselves are responsible for it. People of India have nothing but goodwill for our neighbor, and all that we want is to make sure that we live in peace and harmony, and above all, safety and security in this region. And of course, when we talk of South Asia, we also need to talk about SAARC as the regional body. So we need to revitalize SAARC as well, but we need not go into detail on this here. Let me go quickly to now extended neighborhood. So we are moving away from South Asia and we are talking about extended neighborhood, my definition is that India is really at the central location of Asia, especially because we see our neighborhood covering West Asia, Central Asia, and East Asia. And on top of that, we include the Indian Ocean rim in this definition as well. So in these regions, India has historical ties, and they really need to be understood in the framework of each of those sub-regions. West Asia, the supplier of the bulk of our oil and gas, home to 6 million diaspora, which sends billions of dollars of remittances to India every year, and an area which is affected by great degree of instability. This is very, very important to India. We cannot afford to ignore it at all. As you all know, the Arab Spring happened. It had its impact on countries such as Libya, Egypt, Syria, Yemen, and Iraq. Many of those effects are still continuing. There is a sense of instability. The revolution of hopes turned into a winter of discontent and discord. And then, of course, what the experts call the mother of all Arab problems, the Israel-Palestine conflict continues. And as we saw, as we have seen, the Gaza bloodshed has further aggravated it. So fundamentally, this is a region in which India has very close civilizational linkages. The area can also, with a stretch, include Iran, a country with which we have had very close relations, but a country which is now having a very complex relationship with the West, with Arabs, with other countries. So we have to continue fundamentally to play a role in this region of West Asia and Iran in such a manner that we remain friends of everybody and adversary of nobody. We have very complex interests which is diverse, and the best way to deal with it is to be creative but cautious. And I think this is what the government is trying to do. The other segment of this region, Central Asia, now is a region on which I'm afraid our knowledge base has remained very limited. In fact, until the Soviet Union ended, we really saw this region only indirectly. But now this region with its 5 countries, and I've listed them there, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan, are important countries. Russia remains an important player there, but China is becoming very, very influential there. So India has to continue its Connect Central Asia policy and find a way to enhance its economic cooperation and connectivity with Central Asia. And then there is East Asia. East Asia, Look East policy, as I mentioned, started by Narasimha Rao, then expanded by Vajpayee and then by Dr. Manmohan Singh. This remains, I think, a cornerstone of our foreign policy. And as I speak to you, our foreign minister is today in the capital of Myanmar, Naypyidaw, attending a series of major meetings relating to ASEAN and East Asia Summit. So it can be said that by deepening further and by strengthening further Look East policy, which essentially focuses on creating greater political cooperation, trade and investment linkages with countries of ASEAN and other countries in that area, China, Japan, South Korea, Australia, we can truly help this attainment of mutual interest. I shall skip the Indian Ocean at regions which often get neglected, and then that is not appreciated very much. And here I am referring to Africa and Latin America. In other regions, Africa has to be mentioned first because this has been a region of 54 or 55 countries considered very close to us historically. I mentioned to you earlier about the Nehruvian view of colonialism. And I must say that while in the earlier decades of our independence, our relationship with Africa was largely political, cultural cooperation, and training programs. This has now vastly expanded in the last 5 to 6 years. Indian and African leaders held two major summit meetings, one in 2008 and the other in 2011. And these summit meetings have seen major decisions. India has invested heavily through various instruments. And there is a feeling in Africa that not only India is a good benign friend, it is able to give to African nations the kind of needs they have in the skill building, in new investment in technology, in trade relationships, and also in pursuing African agenda in world circumstances. I would particularly like to highlight Latin America, which is probably the least developed region in terms of India's foreign policy. Not least developed in terms of its own development, but a region which receives very limited attention from us. I have a feeling that this is going to change. And I think in the very first 2 months of taking office, Prime Minister Modi had the chance to go to Brazil, as you know, to participate in the BRICS summit. And there he said categorically, and I'm going to quote him, "In a globalized and interconnected world, our destinies are interlinked." So it said, and he assured the South American leaders that India's relations with Latin America would now expand. And so I do feel that just as we have done it with Africa, I think time has come for us to start planning an India-South America Forum Summit so that in a structured manner, this relationship could be expanded. In doing so, India would help them, but India would also expand its role as a global player. India would also help in securing its economic interests. So many of you young people sitting here, my advice would be to read more about Africa and Latin America, and in whatever field you specialize, see what is happening in these two continents, very important continents, in your own specialized study. I know I have taken considerable time, but now I am coming to the high table. So you have to still pay attention. The high table is a diplomatic concept. So if an ambassador hosts a dinner where he invites 50 people, he cannot put all 50 people on one table. So he sets up various round tables and he puts one round table where he puts the most important or the high-ranking guests. That is the high table. So if your director invites outside dignitaries, and if there is a director from IIT Kanpur or Chennai, or I'm sure that person will find a place on our director's high table. So high table is the one which relates to the major powers. Major powers in terms of military strength, economic strength, in terms of their influence. There certainly are those 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council: US, Russia, China, UK, France. But I think we should also remember that there are countries such as Japan and Germany, which are not members of the Security Council, but they are virtually part of the high table. And we have to certainly recognize that India is also a part of the high table. Now, this is one interesting question that those who are really interested in foreign affairs can discuss among yourselves. How do we describe India? Is India a regional power, or a great power, or a superpower? My answer would be none of the above. I strongly believe that India today is a trans-regional power and an aspiring great power. A trans-regional power and an aspiring great power. For us to realize our dream to be a great power, we will have to do a lot more. We will have to secure greater economic strength, improve our infrastructure and connectivity with the neighborhood, our military capability, effectiveness of our nuclear arsenal, and also adopt a truly holistic foreign policy and national security policy. Now, in terms of the high table, the central advice would be that India has to learn the art of balancing its relations with the major power. We work on the principle of strategic autonomy. That means we are ready to work with everybody. We are ready to be friends with everybody as long as our national interests are not jeopardized, as long as our national interests are promoted. So in this context, once again, specialized students of foreign affairs, they can discuss among themselves the playing of two triangles, which are very interesting and important. One is the relationship involving India, China, US. And the other is involving the triangle involving India, China, and Japan. Reams and reams of pages are being written on this. Due to shortage of time, you will appreciate I cannot go into details here. But these are exciting subjects, and just as scholars are excited about them, policy makers who really have to focus on this on a day-to-day basis, I'm sure, are also looking at the working of these two critical triangles. Essentially, all that I can say is that in history, this is a special moment for India. It's a moment where India wants friendly relations with all, and what is more important is that all countries, almost all countries, are busy wooing India and wanting friendship with India. Coming almost to the end now, I wanted to bring in something which is not often mentioned in the foreign policy discourse, and this is to indicate to you how we are moving into what is called non-traditional themes. International relations increasingly encompass these issues which are relating to climate change, energy, and of course, terrorism. And this is so because we know that in future, experts tell us water wars may be fought, massive power shortages may occur, food security may be jeopardized, climate change will become a problem, and all kinds of cross-border crimes may happen. They already are happening in some parts of the world. So, and then of course there is this question of technology, cyber security, internet governance. The central point is that foreign policy scholars, those like you who are interested in foreign policy, and policy makers must look at this broader picture. So coming to my parting thoughts, my study shows that we have to lay emphasis on three ifs. Number one, our foreign policy can be effective only if political parties political leaders show greater coherence and solidarity among them, and they try to rise above partisan interests and they care only for national interests. Number two, foreign policy interests would be considerably strengthened if the government follows an integrated strategy to use a smart power. You remember I said in the beginning, the use of hard power and soft power is a smart power. So this is the age of the smart power, and this is what the government would need to focus on. Number three, and this is also important, it may sound a bit partisan, but it is important. The government needs to listen more to the academic and strategic community of this country. Strategic community has now grown from strength to strength. It has attained maturity. There are very many experts that are available, and not just in Delhi, in other parts of India as well. They need to be interacted more often and more meaningfully, so that the government is always full of new and practical ideas to deal with the problems of the world. Above all, young Indians, such as this audience, and I'm very grateful that now the hall is full, young Indians need to internalize the fundamental idea that foreign policy mistakes are not foreign but central to their own interests, to their dreams, hopes and fears. Therefore, a regular endeavor to understand and study foreign policy issues and to follow international developments is no longer optional. It is indeed mandatory given the 21st century world in which we live, study and work. Thank you very much.
India's investment in neighboring country like Nepal. Recently, India donated $1 billion US. How does it affect the relation of India with other neighboring countries?
Morning, sir. My name is Becca. My question would pertain to the fact that we recognize India as a knowledge superpower, or Indians generally contribute a lot in the education systems around the world. So, in what ways India's foreign policy will be going ahead to enhance the education systems? For example, like in institutes of national importance like the IITs and IICs and other institutes, how are we going to collaborate with other nations, for example, the BRICS nations, where Brazil and China, in fact, is pretty dominant on the knowledge front as of now?
Prime Minister went to Nepal. He had very productive, very exciting visit there. And among various announcements that were made, one was that India would offer a package of $1 billion as credit to Nepal for executing various projects and trade linkages. And so the question is, how will it be seen by other countries in the neighborhood? I think it would be seen in a very positive manner, because this will be seen as an indicator of India's goodwill to the neighborhood. Mind you, this is not the first time India is doing this. India has invested heavily in the neighborhood, as I explained. India has extended millions and millions of dollars of credit to Myanmar, in fact, to Afghanistan. A lot of it is actually as grant also, and to Sri Lanka. So I think this is now a fairly conventional but
very important tool. And so I think if we are doing this with Nepal, it is very welcome in Nepal, and it would be welcome in other countries, because they would feel that as India's economy increases and rises faster, then India's capability to help the neighborhood countries would also grow. And therefore they would begin to see that they have a vested interest in India's faster growth. We are saying continuously there is a link between the development of India and its surrounding region. And that is only possible if there is security, there is friendship, there is cooperation, and I think the new government seems to have conveyed that message very, very well. The question about India being a super knowledge powerhouse, and how education, which is an important instrument in our hands, to be used for the purposes of foreign policy. This is a very pertinent question. I think as we go around in the developing world, we see that this is a very powerful weapon in our hands. I think our universities, our institutions of excellence, our IITs, they are, they win a lot of respect. And so two kinds of things are happening. One is our institutions keep their doors open to foreign students. And I understand that even on your own campus here, there's a sizable number of foreign students. The second thing is that through the scholarship program of the ICCR, the Indian Council of Cultural Relations, a lot of those students come here on scholarships also, which is yet more facility that is made available. And thirdly, then going beyond the university system and in the world where training institutions operate in India, the MEA's ITEC program, Indian Technical and Economic Cooperation Program, that provides short to medium term training facilities. So this is already being done, and as our capabilities increase, we should be able to use the education as an instrument even more. Thirdly, the question with regard to India, Bangladesh, and the river water agreement, and what the plans are. Indeed, right now with Bangladesh, there are two central issues. One is the land boundary agreement, and the other is the Teesta River water sharing agreement. When I was preparing the list of low-hanging fruit, I debated in my mind and I put the land boundary agreement as an easier and a more doable thing quickly. But this is not to underestimate the importance of the river issue. That also has to be resolved. And India is committed to its resolution. The central government will need to take the government of West Bengal and the people of West Bengal with it, so that then the solution, the formula for division of water in the lean period is divided in such a manner that India's interest, which includes West Bengal's interest, and the interest of Bangladesh, both are safeguarded in an equitable manner. I think the thinking in action is in that respect. The fourth question about Israel-Palestine conflict is really about a dilemma, but I think the resolution of that dilemma is quite clear. First of all, the first element of the policy is that India has consistently been supportive of the cause of Palestine. From the beginning, we have felt that they should have very much their own state, and consistently India has supported it. And therefore, and the second element is that when people get killed, then this civilized country's conscience gets really very troubled. And so the humanitarian angle comes in, and therefore very clearly we strictly criticize those who are causing bloodshed and violence. And if it is being caused by both sides, we do not hesitate to say when it is by both sides. The third element is that, as I mentioned in my narrative, India has now balanced its West Asia policy. Israel is a country with which we have a cooperative relationship, and this is nothing that is not known both in our country and outside. So you have seen that both in course of the debate in Parliament on this issue, and then later when the matter was discussed in the UN bodies, particularly Human Rights Council in Geneva, India took a very clear and consistent stand. We want this conflict to stop. We want that innocent civilians on both sides should not be killed. And whatever the problem is, this should be resolved by sitting around the table through peaceful dialogue. I must stress to you that this is one of the cardinal principles of India's foreign policy. And whenever there is an inter-state dispute, whenever there is a dispute even within a country, the best way is the way that Buddha and Gandhi and Malviji taught us, which is sit down, put down your guns, put down your stones, and start talking. And when you will talk purposefully and meaningfully and sincerely, when you will be ready for give and take, all human problems, all international problems can be resolved. This is the ultimate faith that the Indian culture and Indian civilization has taught us. Very important role. We have had the chance to deal with them. I was privileged to serve in several countries where diaspora was important: Myanmar, Canada, South Africa, Kenya. But it is a two-way relationship. Those Indians who left India for greener pastures and made a fortune for themselves, they also owe something to India. And many of them recognize that. They are willing to reciprocate in return. And by the same token, the motherland has to remember the children, even if they went far away. And many of them, as I mentioned to you, continue to help India in a very big way. The final question about the conflict between India's national interests and international responsibility. I think in order to meet that dilemma, that need for balance, the government has developed, and scholars have developed the idea of enlightened national interest. We are not asking India to only act on self-interest. If every country starts only thinking of self-interest, there will be the law of jungle in the world out there. We have to promote our interests, but also we have to remember that by promoting the interests of the neighbor, we are helping ourselves. And that balance has to come from the policy maker. And those of us, scholars, academicians, university professors, they have full right in this country to give ideas and recommendations and advice to the government as to how to handle and how to balance that recent question. Thank you very much.
May I now request Professor S.N. Mahendra, former chairman, Institute Lecture Series, to join Mr. Rajesh Shankar, our director, in felicitating Mr. Rajiv Kumar Bhatia.
that is taking place in India. And this change is talking about ability to stand, ability to think independently and move forward. There were questions about how we should use strength, and I think the example of Iran comes out as a very sad tragedy. That what started 10 years ago as a way to control terrorism has turned out to be a disaster, where not only so much suffering has taken place because of the war, but it has actually added to terrorism and created a scenario which is much more explosive than what it was 10 years ago. So your words that we need maturity and not knee-jerk reactions, I think is very important. Rightfully pointed out how India's view, the new impetus, the new directions that are being given, start with the surrounding region. So we start with ourselves, self-confidence, self-relax, but then we move out to the next layer, to our immediate region, which will be South Asia. And the initiative of the government, new government, is really not just laudable, but turning out to be very effective in changing the atmosphere in one stroke. And as India, and clearly you also pointed out, that it has to connect all the way up to the international, the far international, and the high table. And recently the BRICS summit, and if you look at the word BRICS, there is only one vowel in that word. And that vowel is what allows you to pronounce it. If there was, and that vowel is I for India. So India can play a role in cementing new relationships which will help the multipolar world of today come out of the tragedies that we are seeing and we continue to see. And thank you for opening our eyes to a very rich, very wide, very diverse, and sometimes tragical situation. And if we want to come out of it, we need understanding and self-confidence. Thank you for a very insightful year.
On behalf of the Institute and on behalf of the Ministry of External Affairs, Public Diplomacy, Government of India, I take this opportunity to thank Ambassador Rajiv Kumar Bhatia, Director General, International Council of World Affairs, to deliver the 6th Institute Lecture Series of the Institute. I am also thankful to our Director, Professor Rajiv Saigal, for sparing his valuable time, almost 2 hours, on which he is here and being with us. I am thankful to Professor Rajni Ranjan Jha, Dean, Faculty of Social Science, and an expert political scientist, who has made it, in spite of his one of the prime engagement which he had already made before, which he cancelled for this thing. I must mention Professor K.K. Srivastava, member Board of Governing Body, IIT, whose presence empowers us and encourages us to take up this activity further. My colleagues, senior colleagues, Professor Mahindra, Professor Agrawal, they have always been contributing very significantly to the success of this, and in details, going into details. I had Chairman Teaching Learning Cell, who has provided us with videography facility for this. Professor Sinha, without whom nothing would have materialized. All physical lecture gets converted because of Chemical Department and this Gopal Tripathi Auditorium and the supporting staff of Department of Chemical Engineering. They thank wholeheartedly, and many of the audience also comprise of Department of Chemical Engineering. So I congratulate Chemical Department and thank Professor Sinha for it. And thankful to all the students who have made it, in spite of the, as was mentioned by the speaker, that Raksha Bandhan is tomorrow. Even after that, I am finding girls and boys both present over here. We have more lectures in series, and your presence in the hall encourages us to go forward, because primarily this lecture series is to cater to you people. We have aimed at educate to innovate and innovate to change. And we have no boundaries. Our director is of the opinion that any individual who has made a significant change in his life should be brought amongst you, so that like Eklavya, they continue to inspire you in your education. So with that perception, you will be coming up with newer lectures, and we hope you will be patronizing it. Thank you very much, and each and everyone, and you all are invited for a cup of tea outside. Thank you.